nothing is perfect, right? And hydropower is no different. So, again, for a long time, particularly in the kind of golden era of building dams, we saw hydropower as having really no downside. But the reality is we're just kind of ignoring the downside, which is not the way that we think about things anymore. I want to show you this diagram. I really like to show you guys kind of propaganda from each side of an issue, right? Because, this thing is just important to remember that sort of thing. So here, you can see this is a drawing of a dam, and it actually is illustrating quite a few of the problems. So first of all, displacement. This would be putting in a new dam. So you can see there's a little village shown here that's underwater. That's been an issue historically, right? Anytime you put in a new reservoir, it oftentimes floods a town because reservoirs typically will fill in a valley, and we like to put little villages in valleys. So globally, that's the situation. Three Gorges Dam, there's just an incredible amount of infrastructure lost. Put in the Three Gorges dams, right? All of those small villages along that river corridor are gone now. They're all underwater. Also, you can see CO2 and CH4. That's something that we're going to examine a little bit towards kind of in the middle of this talk. So there is anaerobic decay that occurs in all of the sediment that gets built up, and it releases methane, which hopefully you remember is one of the strongest greenhouse gases, right? It's a really good dancer, CH4. Also CO2, they're showing all of the euros on the dam, right? So the money that was spent to build the dam. Below that, you can see all these fish bones, right? So those are fish that weren't able to get to the headwaters of the stream to reproduce. And then the electricity is put on some lines and sold, right? So again, we see the people who put the dam in are making a profit off of the dam. That profit is not going to the kind of community that's affected by the dam. So again, keep in mind it's kind of propaganda, but it does highlight a lot of the negative side of hydropower. And really, we're going to look at a couple of different categories, both kind of biological and geological. Save the salmon, right? Fish. This is something that comes up all the time because fish live in rivers, and we're putting dams on rivers, or we have dams on rivers. So particularly fish that migrate from the ocean back to shore, famously sockeye salmon, right, in our neck of the woods. And we spend a lot of money figuring out how to allow fish to navigate the dams that exist, right? So again, on the Columbia River, we have a series of massive dams, and fish can't get past them, of course. What's that great joke? What did the fish say when it ran into the concrete wall? Damn. Bad joke of the day, so you can lock that one away and thank me for it later. So there is an incredible amount of money that's been invested kind of redesigning these dams or modifying or retrofitting these dams in a way that the fish can pass through. Particularly when we look at those dams that were built between 1900 and 1930, those are usually the most notorious dams in the city. They were built with no kind of plan in mind for dealing with fish, and famously, in many of the cases, these old dams, the salmon will actually just pile up at the bottom of the dam because they can't get any further. So in kind of looking at them, with modern eyes looking back, they would be considered illegal now, but many of them already exist. So what you gonna do? This is a chart that shows a couple of different things, but this is total money spent up to 2012. So again, it's actually a little bit stale. Since salmon were listed as an endangered species, which I think was 1992. And at that point, the law says that you need to protect them. So we've spent a lot of money building up a hatcheries program and kind of infrastructure to hopefully get the fish in. So the hatcheries program, one of the hatcheries you might think of is up near Stanley, right? We have a hatchery there right on the Salmon River. And what we do is we just make a ton of artificial fish or hatchery fish, and we dump those in the river and they go on down. And what we've done essentially is to dramatically elevate the amount of fish created so that the percentage that make it back hopefully also rises. people would argue that maybe that's not the best. It's not the best way to think about it. And it's all not free, right? So the second part of this diagram actually takes, we keep very careful count on how many fish return each year, something mandated by the Endangered Species Act. And so we can actually do some pretty basic math and figure out that currently we're paying about, just shy of about $9,000 per fish. If you take the total cost of what we've done with the hatcheries program and also building infrastructure to get fish around these dams, divided by the number of fish who've actually made it back. So again, famously, you may remember this story in Idaho. I think it was 1994. There was one salmon who made it back to Redfish Lake. Redfish Lake is named Redfish Lake because of how many spawning salmon. They get this kind of flushed red color. There was a year that one fish made it back, and that became iconic, right? So oftentimes, similar to a starving polar bear on an iceberg, right? There's a much larger issue, but there's kind of one image that becomes polarizing. The one fish that returned in Idaho in 1994 is similar, right? It became very symbolic. So here you can look, this is a chart that shows wild fish, right? So fish that are not hatchery fish, their return rates, and you can see it's a significant decline since we really kind of started keeping track. This doesn't include hatchery fish, right? So there's a hatchery fish boom that starts in the early 90s, and any salmon fisherman would know if you catch a hatchery fish, that's a salmon you can keep. If you catch a wild fish, you're not allowed to keep a wild fish unless you're native. So the hatchery program, that's kind of one way that we spend money. I mentioned also infrastructure. So infrastructure, generally fish ladders. That's what these things are called. And so remember that the fundamentals of a hydroelectric dam is taking advantage of the difference in elevation of the water, which is what fish don't like, right? So if you're coming in at the lower portion, how the hell are you going to get up here? Well, we basically build a little canal for them to do that. And these, again, can be kind of convoluted. It's a little bit difficult for the fish to find them, but they do work, right? Fish will pass through these. You can see this is a pretty large dam, and the fish ladder associated is kind of a canal with a bunch of concrete kind of buffers in place that slow the water down. And the fish, once they find the entrance to the canal, they can work their way up this fish ladder and then enter the reservoir and get on with it. I mentioned, earlier dams that didn't really take this kind of stuff into account. Also, some dams have a significant elevation difference, right? So getting a fish, up a couple of 100 feet can be a pretty big challenge. So these dams get kind of convoluted. This one always makes me chuckle a little bit looking at it because it's kind of like a M.C. Escher painting, right? So you're asking a lot out of these fish. If you look, kind of follow where the fish would have to go as it comes in the bottom of this image, it takes kind of a left turn, kind of circles around, keeps going up, and then takes a right turn and circles kind of back and forth, and eventually up to the reservoir and out. But again, these do work. One thing that's an interesting kind of byproduct is they also allow people to monitor fish, because we know that the fish can't go up through the dam, and so we can actually watch and keep an eye on the fish ladder and keep track of how many fish had gone by. I remember, younger when I was in college, we would occasionally visit Lower Granite Dam, which is not too far from Lewiston, just kind of south of Moscow in that part of the world. There was a big beach there. People would go and hang out, and you could stop at the dam and look at the fish ladder, and they had a counter, right, that kept track of how many fish had passed through that ladder over the course of the year. Some of these other problems are a little bit more geological. One of the things that we know, again, this is something you'd learn in geology classes, that rivers move sediment. That's what they do. They transport sediment all day, all night, every day. And the ability of that water to carry sediment is a function of how fast that water is flowing. Meaning that if that water slows down, it starts to drop the load that it's carrying. So we've got our wonderful river flowing here, moving sediment along just like it does, right? These little sediment particles are kind of bouncing along, moving downstream, happy-go-lucky. Now, if we put a dam in place, now the flow of water is slowing, right? So it flows down the river, then it gets to our artificial reservoir, and as a result, we see sediment that gets built up. I drew a fairly extreme amount of sediment, but that would actually happen in a dam that's been around since the 1930s, right? You might have 80 or 100 years of sediment built up in this thing, which kind of in and of itself can actually render a reservoir useless, because especially if you're using it to store water, the older that dam is, the shallower that dam is as it fills with sediment over time. But in that sediment, there can be a significant amount of organic material. So all of the critters who are living up here in this still water, the planktonic creatures, we've met this notion before, they will also settle and be deposited within this package of sediment, and as they decay, as they undergo anaerobic decay, they are then releasing CH4 and also CO2 from this kind of environment of anaerobic decay, which is basically like marsh gas application of natural gas. So it fluxes out from the reservoir. It also then, as this gas is bubbling out through the water, is contained in the water, and as it comes out the bottom of the reservoir, we also get outgassing in this area. So this is not a problem with every single dam. This is a problem with a few specific dams, particularly in warmer areas, right? So it's not a universal problem, but some dams are worse about this than others. Those that have a particularly high organic content in their reservoir. So you can see, so this is an image of a reservoir that's empty, and surprise, it's filled with sediment, because that's what reservoirs do. Especially, the older and more mature or longer in use the reservoir is, the more and more sediment is backfilled into it, to the point where in some cases we actually have to dredge a reservoir. We'll see that introduces some other problems. This is a cartoon showing essentially the concept that I drew before, where methane created will bubble out through the water, so the reservoir itself is blowing off methane, but then the water that's coming out of the bottom of the hydroelectric facility is also blowing out methane. So the problem with sediment isn't just a biological one, it's also a geological one. So if our river is running free, what happens is sediment is always being moved down like a game of leapfrog. So during spring runoff, all the sands and particles that are on a beach or a little sandbar might be picked up and moved downstream, but they're replaced from other ones coming from upstream. So sediment is always kind of jumping along, ultimately working its way down the channel. So sediment is fairly evenly distributed. There are beach environments. There's lots of kind of ecological niches associated with that. But we stop that if we put in a reservoir. So I'm going to draw some sediment again. So here we would have our typical flow of sediment, but as the water gets stopped in the reservoir, that sediment will pile up, and downstream we essentially have very depleted, if any, sediment at all. Right? So in the previous example, as that sediment got carried away, it was replenished from sediment upstream. But in places where we're stopping the sediment flow, the downstream portion is depleted of sediment, meaning there's no sands, which can modify, the way the fish behave, or they kind of have evolved to rely on a very specific, type of substrate, but we're not allowing that to flow. So generally what we see is downstream, the waters that are flowing through are picking up sediment, but they strip the riparian areas, the banks and the bed of the stream, they strip it down to bedrock. So all the silt and sand-sized particles are gone, and there's just boulders left. So again, as you can imagine, it has some significant ecological impact. Famously, you can see here, this is a picture of Glen Canyon Dam outside of Page, Arizona. It's kind of the upstream one from Hoover Dam. If you look down here at the foot of the dam, it's just boulders, material that's kind of tumbled down off of the edges of the cliff. There's no sandbars at all, and that has repercussions for who lives there, right? Critter-wise, right? It's animal-wise. So, again, one of the problems with these older dams is they didn't necessarily take this into account, because this was a problem that wasn't going to happen for 50 years. But particularly in the Grand Canyon, and also in the Pacific Northwest, we see this as an issue where we have sediment stripped out of these downstream environments and sediment backed up here. Modern dams kind of take this into account, and they're designed in such a way that essentially the dam controller can pull open the penstock, which is this pathway through the dam, in such a way that will actually sweep huge amounts of sediment out. So you can see this is a dam in the Yellow River in China, and once a year they blow out the sediment. And that will then recharge the kind of beach and stream bed areas further downstream. So here is another image of this thing. Obviously people show up, take a look, you get your selfie taken with a big sediment plume, and you can see, again, not flying out, this is the same dam but a different angle. Glen Canyon Dam, I had mentioned Page, Arizona, we saw that picture. They do this at Glen Canyon Dam, but the dam's not designed to do it. So they do definitely blow this thing open, and some sediment gets blown out. But clearly in this picture you can see the design of the dam isn't such that it scoops up a lot of sediment. So they do this every year on the Grand Canyon. You know, they make sure that everyone's out of the way. It's well known kind of throughout the Colorado River system that floods are coming, and they open this thing and blow some sediment out, but it's not as effective as dams that were really designed specifically to do that on an annual basis. The next thing we're going to talk about is, you know, how we solve some of these problems. And like I said, a lot of dams went in a long time ago. They're not necessarily kind of up to code, and there's lots of problems, upkeep and things like that. They're not in use. They're not generating power. All they are is a sediment trap. Well, the best thing that we could do in that case is to get rid of the dam. And what I would like to point out is that this is not a all dams are bad or all dams are good argument. This is a case of looking at a specific dam and saying, okay, is this what we would call a deadbeat dam? Does this dam do anything? Is it generating power? Is it creating irrigation water? Or is this a dam that we could do without? And we have really, over the last 10 years, started to enter the phase of dam removal in the United States, which again, is kind of targeting dams that aren't functioning, that aren't doing anything really important. You can see here, there's quite a few that we want to get rid of. This is some of my favorite kind of guerrilla graffiti here. You know, there was a group of artists, there's a little video about it where they go up and they rappel down with these rollers and paint this thing. It's pretty cool. This dam is still there, but you can see it's not really doing anything, and even in the background you can see there's plants growing in it, right? This thing's just filled with sediment. It's a non-functioning dam. But like I said, we have entered the realm of dam removal, and there are dam removal projects happening all over the country right now. So this, you can see this first image, this is the Rogue River in Northern California. There's a couple of different ways to do dam removal. You can either do it surgically or explosively, right? And so this is an example of them doing it surgically. One of the problems when that happens is if you remove your dam, you have all of this sediment back here, and that sediment's going to go somewhere. It's basically going to kind of come out as a slug, ultimately run out that watershed. There's some other problems that can actually have toxins in it. A big one is lead, right? From when we used to really freely use lead. So there can be, you know, mining waste, some bad stuff in here, but generally, again, it's better just to kind of clear the throat and get the river back to normal. And that happens in a very short amount of time. So if we get rid of our dam, first of all, we have to get the water out, right? So we'll drain our water, then this big slug of sediment is gonna come out. So you can see here, this is actually the results of that. This is looking from a dam that's being in the process of being removed, looking upstream, and you can see all of that sediment is artificial, right? It's kind of packed in there over the years, and when the water is removed and the dam is being removed, that sediment starts to strip out. It actually will wash out fairly quickly, and have some environmental repercussions in a beneficial way. So this is the Elwha Dam, this famous dam up in Olympic National Park, not too far from Seattle. And the Elwha Dam was removed. You can see this is the process of it getting removed. And as that package of sediment kind of washed out, it basically recharged a depleted delta environment, right? So actually this is an incredible picture. You can see this is a before and after downstream from where the Elwha Dam was removed. On the left you can see the delta where the Elwha River was flowing into the Pacific. Not much. The beaches are incredibly depleted. Not much nutrients for fish and all of the things that kind of live in that area and rely upon that stuff. And then on the right, you can see replenishment, right? This thing is pretty big now and functioning, right? So the river's now running naturally. It's a reestablished salmon run, so salmon are running all the way back into the headwaters of the Elwha. It's an incredible success story, and it's the largest dam removal project we've taken on as a nation to date, although there are larger ones on the books. And so in this last image, you can see really this kind of beautifully reestablished delta, which again is supplying sediment and organic material for all of the creatures, the critters that are living in the ocean in that area, and we start to see recovery of all sorts of biological systems. So a pretty good success story. So it's again an example of looking at which dams are what we would call deadbeat dams versus which dams are producing power. Right? We're not going to replace, the Bonneville Dam or some of these massive dams on the Columbia River because they produce a lot of energy. But some of the smaller ones, maybe some of the older ones, the pre-1930s, the pre-1950s ones, the ones that have a lot of technical issues, sometimes it actually makes more sense just to get rid of the dam because if they're not producing hydropower, what really good are they doing? If they're not producing hydropower or providing irrigation water, what are they really doing for us? So it really is an era of kind of taking a second look at these things. All right, well that'll do it for hydro. We're gonna pick up and start talking about solar power next, or power from the sun. All right, see you then.